Okay, so here is the guitar we are looking at today. This is the BC Rich Lucky-8 Warlock. It's an 8-string Warlock, bolt-on neck, full mahogany guitar, so mahogany body and neck. It's got a rosewood fretboard, 8 inline headstock, Duncan designed blackouts, a hipshot style hardtail bridge, 2 volumes, 1 tone, and a 3-way switch. Now this guitar needs some work. The big thing is the neck geometry needs some adjustment. As you can see right here, our action is not abysmal. At the 24th fret, we have about 2 centimeters, or rather 2 millimeters on the bass side, and about 2 millimeters on the treble side. That is roughly 3/32 of an inch, 6/64. It's not awful. I'd like to see if I can't get that a little bit lower. But in order to affect that, I really need to pay attention to the condition of the bridge. So the bridge has a little bit of adjustability remaining. You can very faintly see. Put some spotlight on here. So you can see there's still a little bit of space underneath each of the saddles, but the screws are sticking up quite high. Now I could go ahead and lower those saddles, and the screws will be sticking way up in the air. They'll be really uncomfortable. What I could do is just shave the length of the screws down. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to go the easier option, which will also afford me more adjustability in the future, and throw in a shim. This is a 1/2 degree shim. It'd probably be better to do a 1/4 degree because I don't need that much additional adjustment, but a 1/2 degree is what I've got on hand. The second thing that's going on, you may already be able to see it, is that this volume pot is busted. This is a split shaft pot, and the knob is a knurled style, but it's got a set screw. So that set screw was screwed way in, it grabbed the side of the split shaft and snapped it in. So this pot, though it still functions, will never really hold the knob on very well. It'll click on, but there's a lot of slop in it, a lot of play. That's not actually the shaft moving around, that's just the knob itself not sitting flush. So that's got to go. This guitar is going to get rewired for a single volume, no tone. The 3-way switch is in good condition. And to fill the holes that are left over, I'm going to use some 8mm plastic pipe plugs, which should blend very well into the body. They'll be noticeable if you're looking for them, but they shouldn't be a big deal. The other two things that are going to get done, rather, is the frets are in really good condition. They're mostly level. There's a couple of low spots and a couple of high spots. If they were just high spots, then I would just spot level it. But because there are also some low spots, the whole plane of the frets need to come down ever so slightly to match that. So it's going to get a full fret level. It shouldn't take too much. And this nut, despite the fact that it's actually decent, and yes, I know the truss rod cover is off. I do have it. I took it off. It's sitting in a secure location. It's not lost. The nut is made of plastic, and there are a couple of strings. I don't know if you can see this very well. The strings actually kind of rattle around in the slots a little bit because they're cut a little bit too wide. So instead of trying to fill it in and recut it, because it's plastic, I'm just going to take it off and I'm going to replace it with a piece of Graphtec. So let's get started on the work. Now that the strings are off, it is time to check to make sure the neck is completely straight, and then I'll mask it up and mark it off to prepare it for the fret leveling. Okay, so what I noticed is that there's actually a little bit of back bow without string tension, and that makes sense. This is an 8-string guitar. There's a lot of tension on there. It's also a mahogany neck, which is not going to be quite as stiff as something like maple or walnut, any of the other kind of common neck timbers. So I'm just going to give it a slight adjustment forward, see what it does. Alright, that is sufficient. You'll notice I'm not using a notched straight edge or anything like that. I've never really felt the need to use one. Can if you like. A notched straight edge will sit across the fretboard. Imagine there's a bunch of divots cut into this that fit over the frets and right across the top of the frets and contact just the fretboard. The reason I don't necessarily like using them is the neck could be completely straight, but there might be some weird divots, dips, valleys, peaks in the fretboard itself, and this is just something that's going to happen naturally over time. I'd rather trust my sight and make sure that the fret, or that the neck itself, is completely straight as a sort of package deal, and then just work the frets to that point. So that's what I do. Okay, the tools of the hour. The humble Sharpie. And my trusty dusty Fret Guru leveling beam. Before I begin, I'm going to kind of talk about my methodology here. You may notice that the neck is still on the body, and I've got the Fret Guru neck rest thingy set sort of in the middle of the neck. I'm going to use very light pressure. I'm not going to use any pressure at all. I'm not going to have my hand in the middle sort of just grinding away at it. I'm going to take it low and slow. The reason why the neck is still on the body is because I don't want to run the risk of the neck in this area changing in any way, being not attached. So if I were to take this neck off, there might be a bend somewhere in the heel of the neck that I won't be able to account for. So having the neck attached to the body still is a known factor. I know how it's behaving at this point, so I'm ready to begin. I'm going to take a couple of passes, and then I'm going to move the camera so that you can see what's going on here. Okay, so it might be a little tough to see. This side of this fret has been touched slightly, but you can see that this fret is almost completely touched by the tool. This fret, almost all of the Sharpie has been knocked down. Same for these. Okay, we're going down and we're seeing exposure of bare metal almost all the way along. As we get towards the 10th to 12th fret sort of region. You can see that there's been some removal on this side. The 12th fret itself, there is some removal extending almost all the way to the G string, but then it stops. The 11th fret, there's removal almost halfway up. The same can be said for these. So this area of the fretboard is a low spot, because as we go further down, you can see that the line of material that's being pulled away is going almost all the way to the side of the fretboard. And that is a trend that continues all the way up to the end of the neck. Each of the frets have an exposed line. I know it doesn't look like it right here, this because of the lighting angle. As you can see, nice and clean, nice and shiny. The first fret right here is still a little low in the middle, and it's because of this fret right here. So I'm just going to come in and just slightly touch this down by hand. Okay, leveling is done. Time to start crowning these. Process is going to involve hitting it with just a little bit more Sharpie across the very top. Again, it'd be nice if my Sharpies worked. And then I'm going to take my triangle file. I've got a safe edge ground in right here, so it can rest nice and easy on top of the fretboard. Now the thing to note that when you're doing this is that you're not keeping the file perfectly flat on top of the fret. You want to kind of slowly kick it over and roll it over. So as you're filing, slowly rolling it over instead of keeping the top of that file perfectly parallel to the fretboard and just grinding and grinding and grinding, removing material. You don't want to do that. You want to roll that fret over. Roll the fret over. Okay? You're rolling that fret. And this is what you want to be left with. A very, very thin line of Sharpie all the way across the top of the fret. Very thin line of Sharpie. You want it dead in the center. Hard part's over. Time to polish. Alright, so I like to start off with these burgundy Scotchbrite pads. These are really good for just knocking off sanding and tool marks. Those burgundy pads remove a lot of material, not enough to change the shape of the frets, really. It'll smooth it over, it'll roll it over a little bit more. But the dark gray ones are much finer, and will run along this side, and that's going to remove the tool marks from the burgundy. Okay, now the frets are clean. They're starting to get a little bit shiny. These are nickel frets. This is super easy. I normally work with stainless steel, which does take a long time and a lot more elbow grease to get clean. But the advantage of stainless steel is you really only ever have to do it once. You may need to clean them up every now and again, but mirror polish is kind of a one-time thing. So, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to clean up my workstation here just a little bit, just to keep it from getting overwhelming. And then I'm going to come back with a Dremel and get the final polish on these frets. Okay, so for polishing, what I'm going to use here is my Dremel, just a Dremel 4000 rotary tool. Got some wool felt wheels. And the two compounds that I'm going to use are this white sort of cutting style compound. This is going to remove all the tool marks from the previous bits of Scotchbrite. And then we've got this green mirror buffing compound. This is what's going to give us that glassy final polish. I'm going to set for about 10,000 RPM. Okay, white compound is done. Fortunately, it used up all of my wheels. I don't have any left, so I've got to use the little nubby guy. Time to move on to the green. A lot of work and a huge mess. It doesn't look like much now, but once I get all this masking tape off and clean up the fretboard, these frets are going to be nice and glassy. It's going to look great. There's a guitar underneath all that tape. Believe it or not. Alright, time to get the lemon oil involved. I've got this bottle of Diodario lemon oil, cleaner and conditioner, that I've had for the better part of, I don't know, 10 years now. Okay, it's time to start thinking about this shim. It's just a Stumac bass shim. It's just wide enough for it to be useful on an 8-string guitar. There's going to be a tiny little gap on either side inside the neck pocket. That's not that big of a deal. What you don't want is to have just a tiny little piece of like a playing card stacked in the bottom of the pocket that creates an air gap underneath the majority of the heel. That can, over time, eventually cause the heel of the neck to warp up. As long as we've got full length coverage, which we will have with this shim, across the entire pocket, we'll be good. Shall see. Yep, there is a tiny little strip of something. Yep. certainly something. Should be able to see it here. You can see the imprint of that little piece of plastic right there. It really was doing nothing except creating an air gap between the heel of the neck and the pocket. And over time it just kind of got crushed in because this mahogany is something of a softer wood. And this just tends to happen if you don't shim it properly. Just trace around the heel. This material is so thin you can get away with cutting it with kitchen shears. Not just more or less follow the line. Alright, it is shaped. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to Sharpie the edges black. And once the neck's on, it'll blend right in. You won't be able to see it. Okay, and again, because this material is really thin and soft, I'm just going to cut out the screw holes by hand. Well, we had a little bit of a blowout. That's fine. It's not a big deal. It'll still work. I'll just let that sit and cure for a bit. Okay, well, I've got the neck out still. I'm just going to dust all this out. There's a lot of tool dust in here. Okay, with the shim in place, remember, we had a 2mm action on both the base and the treble side. And I wanted to get that just a little bit lower without lowering the bridge anymore. So that's why we added the shim. So, I've not adjusted the bridge at all. I take the straight edge, point it up on the nut, and drop it down on the bridge. It's almost perfectly parallel to the frets itself now. There would be fret contact all the way down. So, mission accomplished. I can raise this bridge for some additional comfort. Those screws aren't going to be cutting into the side of my palm. And I've got downward adjustment if I ever needed it. It's now time to get this nut off of here. A couple considerations. One, the chance that the factory applied entirely too much glue to the nut slot is ever present. So what I'm doing is I'm just kind of getting my X-Acto blade in there and scoring around the perimeter of the nut in the hopes that when I start tapping on it, that glue will just break free. The second consideration is that this nut is actually inset below the faceplate of the headstock. So there's a little slot actually set in right there. And it is very easy to break that off. So I really want to avoid doing that. So what I'm going to do, just got this bit of wood here, set that on, and a dead blow hammer. I'm just going to gently tap. Hey, nothing to it but to do it. And that's actually, yeah, that's great. That's about as much super glue as you ever want to see on there. It's just a tiny little dab in the corners. Being very sparing with the chisel. I'm just trying to scrape that old glue off. Okay, had to swap battery. Or not battery, SD card, but you didn't miss anything interesting. It was just me cleaning up this slot here for the nut. So we've got no rock across the bed, no rock on the face on the end of the fretboard here, and no twisting action, which means that we are perfect 90 degrees. That took very little effort to clean up, and that's what you look for. However, this little bit of binding right here is a little bit proud of the fretboard, so I'll just trim that down a touch. Try not to fillet my finger. Because this nut is more or less in good condition and only had that one flaw of a couple of the strings being able to move side to side, I'm actually going to use this as a template to cut the new Graphtec blank. Black Tusk XL. Good stuff. Okay, over here on the bench, we've got the nut blank here. Just kind of feeling the sides. I think this is the side that's going to be against the fretboard. And this is the side so this is going to go against the fretboard, and this side is going to go into the bed. I'm just using the 120 grit side of my leveling beam. You can see there's a very nice hollow directly in the middle, and we want to sand that out. Easy as that. There we go. Didn't need to do very much on the bottom at all. It's already smooth. Survey says square. Perfect. Now I'm going to start using the old nut as a reference guide for the new one. And trim it slightly oversized. Give myself room to bring it down true. These things smell like so much burning plastic when you cut through them. And unfortunately, this one may have a void in it. Thankfully, most of the void is on the offcut. This side, it's very shallow, but it's still there. And it may definitely be visible, but I don't think it's going to affect. I don't think it's going to affect anything at all. I think it'll mostly sand out. Okay, so I've already faced the two sides that are going to be contacting the guitar at a 90. The other side is how I'm going to reduce the thickness down to fit on the nut slot. Now, I just tested it, and it only needs to come down ever so slightly. A couple of passes or so on the sanding beam, and it should be perfect. And perfect. It is snug, but not stiff. So now what I'm going to do is I've got this pencil here that's been planed straight down the middle. It's going to ride on top of the frets, and it's going to draw a line. Just like so. Okay, super glue and masking tape time. Got some super glue sitting on the bench pin. I'm going to put some on the bottom of the nut. Varnish it down really nice. Get a line all the way across. I'm going to clamp this just for a couple of minutes. Okay, unfortunately, we do have another tiny little void. It's popped up right here. It's very small. It should not end up being in the way of the string slot. Just sand a little bit more, let that void get packed in with a little bit of sanding dust. And then I'm going to saturate it with super glue. Let that cure for a few minutes and it will be like it wasn't even there. Okay, so the top profile has been carved. It is now time to carve the relief on the back. Yep. Bit sharper of a fall away along the back than the factory nut. But that will help prevent the string from following the full width of the nut all the way back, which will reduce friction even more and help with tuning stability. The goal now is to transfer these string slots from the factory nut to the new one. To do that, I'm just going to line them up and use my thinnest fret file or a nut file, and just line it up and drag the line over. And there we go. Now that I've got the nut slots cut and ready to be filed down to fit the strings, what I can do is I can start test fitting this into the guitar and then start slowly sanding the ends to make them fit nice and flush and also very comfortable. I don't want a bunch of sharp points. So it is time to finalize the nut slots. Now these are mostly okay, and the test that I use for this is what's called the tap test. So you're going to fret the third string, or fret the third fret, and then gently tap directly above the first fret. And you should be able to just barely be able to get it to tap. Now pretty much each of these can come down ever so slightly. So that's what I'm going to do. Slack the tension, pull the string out, there we go. That's pretty much perfect. It doesn't take much. You do want to be careful with these super thin strings, because these nut files at this gauge, they're basically tiny little saws. So they will cut through this nut material faster than you would believe. So yeah, that's perfect now. Okay, that required very little adjustment. And the nut height between the strings is really good. None of the strings are buried in the nut, which you don't want. That can increase tension, cause them to bind, and creates that annoying pinging noise where you're adding tension or you're removing tension and all of a sudden it just dumps. So this nut is good. It's good to go. Okay, so the final two pieces of the puzzle here are going to be the saddle height to adjust the string action, as well as your truss rod adjustment. So the truss rod is obviously going to handle things like back bow and neck relief. And the way that I measure it, I know this is an 8 string, so this is going to be a little bit goofy. It should just fit across. Capo the first fret, hold down the 24th fret. I know some people will do the 17th or maybe the 15th. I do the 24th. And I do all my measurements in both millimeters and 32nds of an inch. And I'm just going to grab the 9th fret here, about 1 millimeter, or just under 3/32, or just under a single 32nd of an inch of relief, which is fairly small. The neck ended up being very straight after the level, and it seems to respond to being almost completely straight quite well. Your mileage may vary. Now for checking action, some people I have seen, they will actually, again, fret the first fret, and then they'll measure at the 24th. That to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. One, it's either not going to change anything, or it's kind of, I want to be polite about this, kind of a dick waving contest. Oh, I can get my action so much lower. Yeah, well, if you're measuring at the first fret, obviously, you you might as well just measure at the 3rd fret or measure at the 9th fret, because I can get this action. Look at that. I'm at 1.5 mil right now. Now I'm at 1 millimeter. Hey, that sounds better than 1.5 mil, right? Anyway, you're not going to be fretting up here and down here at the same time. So, in my opinion, fretting the string before you measure it for checking action just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I leave the string open, come down here to the 24th, and I've got, yeah, 1.5 mil, or right about 2/32 of an inch, 4/64, 1/16. The action on the treble side is very low. On the bass side, it's a little bit trickier to read. It's about the same. Yeah. Now it's actually closer to 2 millimeters on the bass side. That to me works better. There's a lot more mass in these bass strings. They tend to reverberate much wider distances. So 2 millimeters is perfectly fine. When you're adjusting the height of the strings, the action of the strings at the saddles, again, there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. You can think about the curvature of the saddle itself, matching the fretboard radius. Personally, for me, the only thing that matters is whether or not the distance that the string has to travel to meet the fretboard is consistent with the radius. The top of the string, that doesn't bother me. Obviously, this 74 on the low F sharp is going to be way higher in feel than the high E right here, which is just a 0.9 or a 0.09. Obviously, it's going to feel thinner in that area. It's going to feel like it's lower than this guy right here. But once you start trying to fret it, it's going to travel more or less the same distance. Okay, so one more thing before I cut out of here. I am doing all of these setups in the seated position. The truss rod, adjusting the action at the saddle. I'm seated. And the reason for that is having the guitar sat on the desk or on the bench or whatever, resting on one of these things, especially in the case of this guitar, it's a mahogany neck, it's 8-string, single truss rod, there's a huge amount of string tension there. Having it sat in that position can exert enough force to kick the headstock forward just a touch. Just a touch. You may not even notice it, but it may lead you to believe that the action is anywhere from a 0.5 mil to 1 mil higher than it really is. So this is how you're playing the guitar. This should be more or less how you're measuring while you're doing your setup. So that's all for now. There's going to be a couple of clips after this showing some of the various odds and ends just to get this guy finished up. But thankfully, this should answer some of the questions and hopefully not bring up too many others. I'm not always the best at explaining things. All right, so for the final sort of thing to think about when setting up the guitar is the truss rod. Now, the truss rod does not have to be a scary thing to deal with. It is a lot harder than you may imagine to actually break or damage one of these things. It's certainly a lot harder than, I don't want to say ignorant, more inexperienced people on forums and other places may say it is. The only thing that you really need to be concerned about is moving it too much in one go. So give it something like 1/8 of a turn, just like that, and then let it sit. Retune, let it sit for 15-20 minutes. The neck will slowly adjust to the new truss rod tension. And if it's still not enough, if you still need a little bit more back bow, or you still need a little bit more relief, rather, then give it another small adjustment. And keep making small adjustments until you get the amount of relief that you need. Little bit of crackling as the plastic sheath around the truss rod crinkles a little bit. That's normal. Loud pings, cracks, pops, sudden shifts in the neck. That's a problem. Take the guitar to a reputable luthier and get it looked at. That's rarely, if ever, going to actually happen. These things are way stronger than you may believe. And for the very last bit of just sort of cleanup work, I used these 8mm pipe plug fittings in order to fill the holes that were left behind from the second volume and tone potentiometers. They were a little bit loose fitting, so I used some hot glue on the inside of the control cavity just to hold them in place and keep them from rattling and buzzing around.